Hey there, everyone, and thank you for listening to Back Talk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine, the podcast talk show for parents. I'm Janice Robinson-Celeste, your host and publisher of Successful Black Parenting Magazine. Know that our hashtag for this show is and go to our Facebook page for Successful Black Parenting and share the link with your followers. Do that right now, and let people know you're joining us. You can comment on Facebook, and I will post the best comments live on air. Now, my guest today is Dr. Kimberly Underwood. Hi, Dr. Kimberly Underwood. How are you?
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here with us today. She is the research chairperson at the University of Phoenix, and we are discussing today the lack of Black male teachers. So, this is an important subject. Now, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this topic?
Sure, I will. Well, first and foremost, I'm the research chair of the Center for Workplace Diversity and Inclusion Research at University of Phoenix. I've been in this position for about 2 years. I've been in diversity and inclusion for about 2 decades, so I think I just dated myself a bit, but that's okay. Uh, but I've been doing
Okay.
this work for a while, specifically in higher education for about the last 6, 7 years. And so, in doing my work and being the lead of the research center, I got this amazing opportunity about a year ago. And the National Network of State Teachers of the Year came to University of Phoenix and said, hey, let's come together and look at some ways where we can collaborate. And so in having initial conversations, it became really clear that this topic was really important to both organizations, and specifically because INSTOY does have a Black Male Fellow program where each year they have 12 African American fellows from across the United States that go through this year-long fellowship. So we wanted to really come together to support them for a year, as well as to look at this topic more in depth as far as the research.
Fantastic. So, how did that's how you got interested in this topic. So, we know it's a problem, and it's a problem from kindergarten on up to higher education. But why is this a problem? Why is this such a big deal that we can't seem to recruit and retain Black male teachers?
I think the big thing is, in doing this work, and our final product was this white paper that we released nationally in June at the INSTOY conference. And the major thing that we found was this number, 2. So 2%. And when you look at, first and foremost, teachers of color within the, teacher population, it's 20%. And so that's a small percentage anyway. But then when you look within that 20% and look specifically at, African American men, it's 2%. And so Black males make up 2% of the teaching population. And so, when you think of it, if I say, your tires on your car have 2% of tread, you're going to do something about it. Or you go to the doctor and he says, well, you only have, 2% air that's coming in your lungs. You're going to do something about it. And so, really thinking about that 2%, what's being done about it. And so, in doing this research and, we looked at different avenues of where, people are doing these efforts to recruit. And so we're finding that, first and foremost, we're relying heavily on alternative certification for those people who, may not have that traditional education degree, finding that pathway into the classroom. There are a lot of grassroots organizations, Troops to Teachers is doing amazing work. Call Me Mr. But yet and still, we're still at 2%. There's been this major reliance on the HBCUs. And I will say that Howard University had this amazing program a few years ago where, basically they were grooming Black male teachers and getting them into the classroom. But of course, with a federally funded program, when funding cuts off, then the program goes away. And so, really looking at what were these different avenues to really, try to move that 2% forward to a higher number, but yet and still we remain static at 2%. And let the truth be told, if you look very closely behind that decimal point, the number's actually going down each year.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's sad to hear. Because you have your white paper report that you guys you just referenced, but the Education Trust also came out with a report this week, and so I know people are starting to pay attention and look at this because it's called "If You Listen, We Will Stay: What Teachers of Color, Why Teachers of Color Leave, and How to Disrupt the Teacher Turnover." And we're working on an article on that now, how parents can help to ask for specific teachers in their schools. If you don't see anyone that looks like you, it's really important that you speak up. But yeah, so is it that they're not being listened to? What are we finding?
I think it's just such a complicated process. We looked at this through the whole career trajectory of the Black male educators, starting in, high school and middle school. And so, first and foremost, are Black males even seeing teaching as a viable option? And we talk about the cycle of, if I don't see, teachers of color that look like me, how do I see this as a viable option for a career? And then you throw other things in it, such as, the over discipline of, students of color, the instances of standardized testing, and we know the bias there. And then you get into, the other issues of, the ability and the aptitude to want to label students of color as being, and I don't like the term, having a learning disability, I'll put it like that, or having some type of challenge that keeps them from, advancing or being successful and, going into the programs and the classes that prepare them adequately for higher education. And so then you get into all of this, as well as pay, teacher pay itself. Teachers, I think, you should almost be paid triple, for the responsibility that you have, so, you get into all of this, and then getting them into, teacher preparation becomes difficult. And then I will say that, historically, and I was in teacher preparation. I was an associate dean of a college of education at a primarily Black institution. And I will say that I was guilty, because as this associate dean, I know that we struggled to get students of color, and specifically male students of color. But I don't think that I ever thought about what 2% meant in this global level and in this capacity, and what the implications were of that at a higher level than outside of my school. So, really, I think that a lot of teacher preparation programs need to take that responsibility. And then once you actually get, Black men through and successfully, and don't forget, we have praxis exams and, ed TPAs and all of those things that they have, the hurdles they have to go through. And then getting into the classroom, then one of the things you have to look at is the actual socialization process, having to take on roles outside of just the classroom teacher. And so specifically, and if you, look at the white paper that we released, we use the voices of the Instoy fellows heavily to narrate a lot of our research. And so you'll see and you'll hear these stories of, they talk about being the disciplinarian. And one, fellow talked about every time a student of color got into trouble, he was pulled out of his classroom to be the disciplinarian. And what he called, and this touched me just when he said, I became all things Black. So anytime anything happened with a student of color, Black student, discipline issue, mentoring was needed. Some of them talk about, having the father figure and, being looked at as the father figure of the school. And, or being put in those coaching roles. And so, they talk about the responsibility. And do understand, one of the things that I will say, they never complained about that. They never complained. And this was a group of people that were so passionate about their students and what they did. And you'll see that within the white paper. But, they talked about also, seeing more people of color and more men of color in those leadership positions, and being able to get there, required them to have a finger and a pulse on the curriculum. And they're like, being in those situations and in those positions where they were in the middle of the action, and they really understood, they were seen as being valuable outside of these coaching and discipline roles, and really being valuable to the curriculum, which they felt was, necessary in order to advance into the assistant principal and principal positions. And so, it's just really a lot of different factors. But I definitely, and I will say I didn't read the report, but I want to read it, because one of the things that we found was, in doing our research, there's not a lot of research out there about what actually goes on once you get in the classroom. So when we talk about the recruitment piece, there's a slew of research there, but once you get into the actual classroom and classroom experiences, there's not a lot of research there. And so actually, from my stance as the research chair, we have launched the 100 Black male educators speak project, where over the next year we are doing in-depth interviews with 100 Black male teachers to look at what goes on in the classroom, because you did make a good point about, retention, and teachers of color are more likely to leave the classroom than their white counterparts. And so, really looking at what are those experiences, how are they socialized, what goes on between, teachers and leadership, what goes on with, colleagues. And so what are those experiences that really, create the dynamic of being socialized as a teacher? And then how does that impact retention? And so that's our next effort.
Okay. So let me ask you, because traditionally teachers have been female and not the heads of households. That's changed, and yet the salaries haven't. How much of it do you think is a money issue? Because you have families to maintain, whether you're male or female, really. But if they can't make the money they need, especially with so many different universities and colleges hiring adjunct professors, and the salaries for adjuncts are nothing. You have adjuncts on welfare, so. How much of that has to do with it?
I mean, I think that, pay is a big issue for a teacher, and really thinking about myself, going through, my bachelor's, my master's, my PhD. I mean, if it wasn't for a fellowship, I knew I couldn't afford my PhD, because I knew I had those loans, and I knew what that meant, going forward. I had to find a job that could help me pay for that. And so, thinking about going through teacher preparation, going for, some type of advanced certification or some advanced degree. I mean, and then coming out and making 30, 40, maybe 50, do I see that as something that is a viable option, especially if I am head of household, or I am a single parent, or a one income household? Is that something that will sustain? And then you think about actually what you hear about education. When you hear, teachers paying for their own supplies a lot of times, or supplementing, the needs of the classroom out of their own pocket, and you put all of that together, it doesn't make teaching attractive to, I think, a lot of people. And even those, unfortunately, those that have a passion have to weigh, the benefits of, taking a career or taking a job somewhere else outside of education, if it is going to provide that income that they can sustain, a certain lifestyle.
I want to just read Crystal's comment that she posted. And she says, I was lucky to have a Black male principal in a small school, third to eighth grade. He walked the halls and engaged in the classroom. I didn't really realize how lucky I was. And I love how she says how lucky she was because it is. It's definitely a benefit. And she actually recognizes that. And it's important. And that's why we're here talking about the lack of Black male teachers today.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, so let me ask you, what is the University of Phoenix doing to recruit and retain Black male teachers? Are they working on it?
And Janice, I will say, to talk about Crystal's comment,
Hmm.
before I get into that, I will say that, in thinking and doing this project and working and doing this research, I thought about the first time I had my first Black male in the classroom, and it was in my PhD program. And he
Oh,
was
wow.
like this unicorn. And it was like, finally, after all these years, I found you. And so, really wanting, if we think about the purpose of education itself, which is to create these productive citizens. And see, one of the things that the Census Bureau has said is that, by the year 2044, we're going to be this majority minority society. And so all this diversity is going to be present. And so we are preparing students that can be productive citizens within this diverse society. And how do you do that if you don't have diversity present in the teaching ranks, right? And so that being said, you asked a question about what University of Phoenix is doing. So I will say that we're just really getting into this. And so, we're looking at our numbers, we're looking specifically at our College of Ed and seeing, what specifically we can do as far as programs. And then I know, like, for instance, we just had a full panel last Friday of Black male educators and hosted that panel to really talk. And we brought political figures together, teachers, administrators, to really have this conversation about, Black males in the classroom and diversifying P through 12 education. And so I will say that we're just really, I'm going to be honest, I don't know if we understood exactly the magnitude of what was going to happen just by this, through this one white paper. And so, now knowing that this is such an important topic, and really starting to do this extra piece of research around it and really delving a bit deeper into this topic, we're really looking at the numbers and seeing what we can do. But we do know that, in conversation and thinking about it, it's going to be collective. Everybody has been doing things in the silo, whether
Hmm.
it's the grassroots, certain programs, so really looking at what we can do more, more concerted efforts, more, collective efforts, and then really looking at, what can be long term and what can be sustainable, and how do we get the right people to come together to remind everyone that, this issue of Black males in the classroom is important. And, one of the things that I will say that in the webinar last week, someone said, well, why aren't you worried about all people of color? And my response was, and I will say it here, in looking at the 20%, there has been growth in each of the demographics, whether we're talking about Black women, whether we're talking about Latino men, uh, uh, Asian women. I mean, there's been growth in all of those demographics, race and gender, except for Black men. And so that is why, we're taking the torch and we're championing for, more research around this and resulting in more programming, more actions, and looking at this from, hopefully a higher level. One of the things I will say during the Obama administration, this became quite a topic, diversifying education. Now, funding fell off, administrations changed, but, something that's long-term sustainable that's being put in place is something that's needed for us to really move past and move the needle beyond that 2%.
Right. Well, what can parents do to encourage their kids' school to take recruiting Black male teachers seriously? Like, how can they be advocates?
I think that anytime you have the ability to champion, and knowing that, know your numbers, know the numbers of your school, not only know the numbers of your school, know the numbers of your district, know the numbers of your state. They are readily available online. And so, being able to, and I also say, know your lawmakers. These are the ones that get these big programs in place, that get funding dedicated, to these types of efforts. And so really being able to champion, outside of just saying to your principal, I would like to see more, Black men in the classroom. This is really a social issue and a problem. And so really a high level problem, getting people at a high level to really be able to see that it is an issue. And one of the things that we're also looking at is moving this white paper, to higher levels and sending it out and promoting it and flying it out at higher levels within government. And so getting that information out and pushing and always saying that they aren't there, because a lot of times I think that, especially in the political arena, we've done this, so we put this money here, we've done this program, and so, oops, fixed. Well, this is something that still is not fixed and needs to be addressed at all levels.
Right. Well, Camille just said it just occurred to her that in all her years of school, and she only seen or ever had 2 Black male teachers. So that's how deep it is. And everyone that you talk to probably can relate. But I like what Crystal also said. She came back and had another question. She said, how much do we discourage Black men from going into teaching in our own community by not valuing it? Or even speaking well of teachers, Black middle class families always seem to push for doctors and lawyers, get that money as our focus. She said her 4-year-old son has a Black male teacher part-time. It makes a difference in his behavior.
Mm-hmm. And
so I agree with that.
Crystal, I completely agree. And, within this paper, we really looked at 3 schools of thoughts, and specifically looking at why Black men are needed in the classroom. And the first being that, there's research out there that says, Black men are good for, students of color. And then there's a second school of thought specifically that says Black men are needed and necessary to educate Black males specifically. And, within both of those schools of thought, there have been, instances where they've shown, increased test scores, increased self-esteem, better grades. And so that's there. But then there's also this school of thought that says, Black men and teachers of color are needed for all students, and for students to be able to understand the value of diversity in society. We have to be able to see that reflected within the most important, place that students will go. When you think about it, school is where, they do a lot of their development, and especially around socializing with others. They do that within the school setting. And so being able to do that in a diverse setting, is important. I think about, when I first started, this was when we had these school shootings and a lot of these public shootings, and thinking about, these shooters and all of this hate, if they had had a more diverse environment, or if they had had some interaction, with, someone of, of color, or of a different race, would that have changed? Could that have changed the situation? And not necessarily saying there's a correlation or anything like that, but it's just, my own personal thought. And so, really looking at this, whatever school of thought you subscribe to, the situation still stands at 2%. How do you know?
Right.
You know, I'm going to be challenged in the next year finding 100 Black male educators to sit down and have this long discussion with, because, 2%. So,
Right. Well, we're running out of time, but I wanted to read Christian's comment. She said she only had one Black male teacher, and he was her music teacher. So, like I said, everybody can relate. Well, I want to
mhm.
thank you all for listening to Back Talk today by Successful Black Parenting Magazine, the podcast talk show for parents. If you missed part of the show, no worries. You can just wait a few minutes and click play for the replay of this podcast. You can share it with anyone who needs to hear it and get the word out. I want to thank you again, Dr. Kimberly Underwood, for coming on our show. This is such a great topic, and it was such a great show. I want to have you back and talk about this again in the future.
Absolutely.
Our next episode will be tomorrow, Saturday, September 28th at 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time and 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I will be interviewing Dr. April Lisbon, who is a school psychologist. She herself is raising an autistic child who also has dyslexia. And we're going to talk about parent support when children are diagnosed with special needs. So make sure you tune in, and you can ask questions in the chat on Facebook. And if your question gets picked, I'll ask it live. One more thing, don't forget to follow us too on Twitter and Facebook at Black Parenting One, and on Instagram, we're at Black Parenting Magazine. So our website is successfulblackparenting.com, and it's full of good content to help you thrive and not just survive as a parent. So be sure to rate our podcast, and until next time, we'll talk soon. Kahari, that's Swahili for goodbye. Take care.
Good night.
All right, we are off air. Oh, wow, we missed one. We had a good one.